The lantern threw a low amber circle across the straw, and inside that circle everything was warm. She moved slowly, the way a person moves when they are not performing work for anyone, but simply doing it. Her boots found the familiar path between the roosts, without her needing to look down. The hens shifted on their perches as she passed, a soft collective murmur, the sound of small things settled and content. Outside the coop walls, the darkness was absolute, and the cold pressed against the boards like something patient and heavy. A thin line of frost traced the bottom edge of the single window, but inside, the straw was deep and dry, and the air held the particular closeness of living warmth. She set her lantern on the shelf she had built low and near the door, where its light spread evenly without startling the birds. Then she lifted the wide basket from its hook and began. The first egg was still body warm against her palm. She laid it into the basket without hurrying. The next, and the one after, each one placed with the same steadiness. The hens watched her with their sideways, unhurried attention, blinking once or twice, unbothered. They knew her now the way animals know a person who has come to them every morning in the dark without fail. She counted quietly, not aloud, but in the way a farmer counts, with her hands and her body keeping record. The basket filled slowly, and then, for a time, all at once. The eggs were pale brown and clean, and they settled against one another in the straw lining with small, satisfying clicks. When she reached the far end of the last roost, she stopped and looked back the length of the coop. 29 birds in various states of early morning drowsiness. Several had already tucked their beaks back under their wings. The lantern light softened their feathers to something almost golden. They were not beautiful birds by any measure a person at a fair would use. They had never been that. But they were hers, and they were here, and every morning they gave her something, where before there had been nothing. She lifted the basket. It was heavier than it had been last week. She noted that without celebration, in the same way she noted the wind direction or the depth of the frost, as information, a fact the morning had offered her and she had accepted. Outside, the frozen fields ran flat and gray toward a horizon that had not yet decided to become light. The neighboring farms sat dark and quiet in the cold, their coops sealed against a winter that had taken the season somewhere past where most people were prepared for it to go. No smoke yet from the far chimney, no lantern moving in the yard beyond the fence line. She stood in the doorway a moment, basket in hand, watching the still gray nothing of early morning. Then she turned back inside, latched the coop door gently behind her, and set the basket on the table. It was not always like this. It was not always like this. The auction had been held on a Tuesday in late October, when the sky sat low and colorless over the county fairgrounds, and the cold had already moved past the kind that bites and into the kind that simply stays. She had arrived early, which was not unusual for her, and had walked the pens quietly before the crowd gathered, the way her grandmother had taught her, not to look for the best animal in the lot, but to look for the animal that everyone else had already decided was not worth looking at. Most of the morning sale went the way of most autumn auctions: hogs, 2 young bulls, a pair of draft horses that drew a long, appreciative murmur from the men along the rail. She watched without bidding. Her coins were few, and she knew exactly what she had come for, even if she could not yet have said precisely what form it would take. They brought the chickens out last. That was the first thing. Sellers always saved the birds for last, when the crowd was thinning and patience had run its course, and the men with good hats were already drifting toward their wagons. The 29 hens came into the pen in a low wooden crate, and the moment the auctioneer's helper set it down on the table, the laughter started. It was not cruel laughter, particularly. It was the laughter of people who considered themselves practical. The birds were ragged in a way that went beyond the ordinary dishevelment of a hen in travel. They were patchy, half their feathers missing or broken, their combs pale, their legs dusty and thin. One man near the fence said they looked like something the dog had already had a go at. Another said he wouldn't take them if they were free, and the group around him seemed to agree this was the sensible position. She stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at them. She did not see what the men saw, or rather, she saw it, the baldness and the rattle of their breathing, and the poor condition of their plumage. But she saw past it in the same moment, the way you learn to read past the surface of a thing when someone who loved you once took the time to teach you how. Her grandmother had kept a flock of this breed for 30 years on a farm with no insulation in the coop and no grain to spare, and those birds had laid through February. She knew the shape of the comb. She knew the particular heaviness through the body, the deepness of the keel. The feathers would grow back. They always did, with this kind. The auctioneer opened at a price so low it was almost an apology. No hand went up. He dropped it further. Still nothing. When she raised her hand, a few heads turned. A man beside her looked down at her the way people look at something that has confused them slightly. The auctioneer paused, his gavel held still, his eyes on her face with an expression she had no interest in reading. She kept her hand up. The gavel came down, and she was the only bidder. She did not look around to see who was watching. She paid at the small table near the gate, counted the coins out carefully onto the wood, and received in return a handwritten slip that entitled her to 29 chickens, which is to say, she received the slip and then received nothing else, because no one came to help her load them. The crates were stacked near the pen, and she moved them herself, one at a time, setting each one against the slats and coaxing the birds through the low door with patient, unhurried hands. The hens did not fight her. That was a thing she noticed. Frightened birds fight. These ones walked in with a kind of dull compliance that was not fear so much as exhaustion, the particular tiredness of animals that have simply been handled too many times by people who did not care what they felt. She latched each crate and carried it to the wagon. Behind her, a comment drifted over from where the men still stood. She did not catch all of it, only the tone, which was the same tone she had heard earlier, easy and unhurried, the way men speak when they are not worried about being heard, because they have not yet learned there is anything to lose by being. She kept moving. The road home was long and the light was already thinning when she turned the wagon out of the auction yard and onto the county road. The fields on either side sat flat and pale, under a sky the color of an old tin pan. The cold had texture in it now, not sharp yet, but building, the way cold does before the first real frost, like something gathering itself at the edges of the air. She drove slowly, partly because the road was rutted and she did not want to jostle the crates, and partly because she kept turning to look at them. Through the slats, she could see the small, alert eyes watching her. Even patched and rough as they were, there was a quality of steadiness about them, not the nervous flickering of a bird that startles easily, a settled kind of attention. She had noticed that in the pen too, but here on the wagon, moving, she could see it more clearly, the way each bird held itself compact and still through the jolting of the road. Her grandmother had said it plainly, the way she said most things. This breed does not waste itself on fear. That is why it has heat left over for winter. She had been young when she heard it, young enough that she had not understood it as practical knowledge so much as a kind of description, a personality being offered to her. But now, watching the hens settle quietly into the straw at the bottom of the crates, she understood it both ways at once. The wagon creaked on through the cold, and her small farm waited at the end of the road. The wagon turned off the county road onto the narrow track that led to her property, and before she had reached the gate, there were already men at the fence. 2 of them at first, then a third, who crossed from the adjacent field when he heard the creaking of the wheels. They stood with their arms resting on the top rail in that particular way that men stand when they intend to watch something and have already decided what they think of it. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the coupe door and climbed down without hurrying. The first crate was heavier than she expected, or perhaps her arms were tired from the long drive. She adjusted her grip and carried it steadily, not dragging it, not rushing. When she set it down on the frozen ground and worked the latch, the hens inside shifted and murmured, but did not scatter wildly. They stepped out with a kind of cautious deliberateness, blinking at the pale winter light, and began to move along the yard with their heads low and their gait measured. One of the men at the fence made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was meant to be heard as one. Another said something about plucked birds at a Sunday table, and the third one, the older one with the gray at his jaw, spoke in a carrying voice that she understood was addressed to her, even though he did not look directly at her. He said he gave them 3 weeks, maybe 2 if the cold came in early like he expected. Said he had seen that kind of bird before, worn down to nothing, and that no amount of good intentions put feathers back on a hen that had already quit. She did not answer. She went back to the wagon for the second crate. She had learned some years ago that there was no useful response to that kind of talk. Not because it was beneath her, but because anything she said would only extend the conversation, and she had work to do before the light failed. The coupe walls needed checking. She had found a gap near the northwest corner on her last inspection, and there was a section of roofing board that sat loose at one end. Those things needed addressing today, not tomorrow. She carried the second crate and then the third, and when all 29 birds were moving in the yard, she walked the fence line of the run slowly, pressing her hand against each plank, testing the gaps at the base where wind could drive through. The men at the fence watched for a while longer, said a few more things, and eventually drifted back toward their own farms. She went inside the coupe and stood in the dim interior, letting her eyes adjust. The smell of old straw and dry wood. She ran her palm along the seam where the north wall met the floor. Cold air pressed through, thin but present. She knelt down and made note of it, then stood and looked at what the coming days would require. There was enough to do. She began. The first gap she filled with a strip of old feed sack folded twice and pressed into the seam along the northwest corner, then tacked in place with short nails she had saved in a tin on the workbench. It held. She tested it with her palm, the way her grandmother had taught her, not with sight, but with the skin, feeling for the thread of cold air that a crack will send through even a gloved hand if you hold still long enough. The gap was closed. She moved on. She worked through the first week in pieces, an hour before the morning chores, and another hour in the early dark after. She cut sections from a stack of feed sacks she had kept folded in the corner of the shed, using them to line the lower portions of the 3 weakest walls, where the boards had dried and pulled apart at the edges. Against the outside of the coupe, she stacked straw bales 2 deep along the north and west faces, the sides that would take the worst of the coming wind. They were heavy, and she moved them alone, setting each one into position and pressing it flush against the boards. When she was done, the outside of the coupe looked ungainly, bundled like something wrapped for storage. She did not mind how it looked. She built the draft shield for the door from salvaged board she found stacked behind the shed, a low panel, just knee-height, fitted to rest in a slot she notched into the door frame so it could be lifted out when she needed full entry. It was not fine work. It was sufficient work, which was the kind that lasted. The mornings grew colder. She began heating water on the stove each dawn and mixing it into the grain with kitchen scraps, peelings, the outside leaves of cabbages, the water she had boiled root vegetables in. The mash went into the coupe warm, steaming faintly in the cold air, and the birds came to it with a steadiness that told her something she had not yet been certain of. They were eating well. They were alert. The bald patches on several of them were already showing the faint dark points of new feathers coming in at the roots. One morning, a neighbor passed on the county road and stopped at the fence. He watched her carry the pot from the house and push through the coupe door. When she came back out, he called across the yard that she was cooking for birds that would be dead by the first hard frost, and that warm mash wouldn't change what was already written for them. She set the empty pot down at the coupe door and looked over at him briefly. He was not wrong to think what he thought. He was working from what was visible, which was a yard full of ragged birds, and a woman spending her mornings at the stove for them. What he was not working from was what she knew. She picked up the pot and walked back toward the house. The cold was coming. There was more to do. The cold came down in the second week of December and did not lift. It arrived not with a storm, but with a stillness, the kind that settles into the ground and stays, that turns mud to iron overnight and keeps it there. The sky went the color of old pewter and held that color for days at a time without changing. Water left in a bucket at dusk was solid by morning. The county road, usually soft enough to show wheel tracks, rang underfoot like packed stone. It was the kind of cold that old people in the township spoke about in a particular way, not boasting, but careful, as if naming it too loudly might invite more of it. The kind that came once in a generation and left its mark on the farming calendar for years afterward. The kind that tested everything a farm was built on. Across the road, the neighbor who kept a double row of laying hens in a well-built coop reported that his flock had gone off lay by the 3rd day of the hard freeze. He was not alone. Down the county road, past the old mill property, a farm with nearly 40 hens went quiet that same week. The birds were alive, huddled together in the back corners of their shelter, but they were not laying. Cold of this depth did something to a modern laying hen. It pulled the body inward, away from production, toward simple survival. There was no fault in it. It was the body doing what it knew. By the middle of December, the pattern was the same on every farm in the township that kept chickens. Coops that had been producing steadily through autumn had gone silent. A few farmers cracked open their stores of preserved eggs. A few others drove into town and found the feed store's egg supply already running thin. Nobody had planned for a winter this long, this early, this complete, in its cold. She had planned for it, not because she had known the winter would be this severe, but because she had known, in the way the breed itself seemed to know, that cold was always a possibility and not a surprise. She pushed open the coupe door in the gray morning light and stood inside for a moment while her eyes adjusted. The birds were awake, moving, scratching at the straw. The shelter held its warmth from their bodies and from the insulation she had packed into the walls in October. The feed sacks, the extra straw bales, the boards she had fitted against the gaps. It was not warm by any comfortable measure, but it was above freezing. It was enough. She moved along the nesting boxes slowly, the way she had learned to, without rushing, without disturbing the rhythm of the coupe. She worked from one end to the other and counted as she went. 22 eggs. She stood for a moment with the basket resting against her hip and looked at what was in it. 22 eggs in the coldest week any farmer in the township could clearly name. She went back to the house to start the morning mash. The mash was the first thing, before anything else. She had learned that early, before the first frost had even settled properly on the ground. The birds drank more willingly when the water was not half frozen, and they ate more steadily when the grain came warm rather than cold and stiff from the overnight air. It was a small thing, a careful thing. But she had watched what happened when she brought the mash too late on a cold morning. The hens would stand a little hunched, a little turned in on themselves, and she had decided then that she would always be up before that posture had a chance to form. So, she rose in the dark that first hard frost morning, when the temperature had dropped well below what the previous weeks had offered, and the window glass had grown a fern of ice across its lower corner. She lit the lamp on the shelf above the stove and fed wood into the firebox until she heard the draft catch. She filled the pot with water from the bucket inside the door. She had learned not to leave water where it could freeze solid overnight. And she set it on the heat and waited, standing close to the stove, with her arms folded against the cold that still lingered in the room. When the water was warm, she added the cracked grain and the kitchen scraps, and stirred the mash until it was even throughout, no dry pockets, no cold lumps at the bottom. She had done this enough times now that her hands knew the motion. Stir until the steam comes evenly, not rolling boil, not cold, just warm and steady and ready to carry. She wrapped her coat around her and lifted the pot with a cloth and walked out into the frozen yard. The cold was the kind that pressed flat against the face and made the lungs tighten on the first breath. The stars were still out, very bright in the way that only happened when the air was truly clear and the moisture had been driven out of it by the dropping temperature. Her boots made a sound on the frost that was closer to a crack than a crunch. At the coupe, she set the pot down to unlatch the door, and then she reached for the water pans first, a habit, and broke the thin shell of ice from each one with the heel of her palm, the way she had seen it done before. On a morning much like this one, a kitchen in the gray dark, a lamp on a shelf, a woman with hands that moved without hesitation through the cold morning motions of care. Her grandmother's hands had done exactly this, the same order. Water first, then mash, then a low sound made at the birds. Not words exactly, just a tone that said, "I am here, and the cold is outside, and there is something warm coming." She had not thought about it consciously until this moment. She simply found herself doing it the same way, in the same order, and the hens lifted their heads and came forward toward the warmth. The word did not travel the way news travels in summer, with people stopping on roads and calling across fences. It moved the way things move in deep winter, slowly, through walls, through kitchens, passed from one household to the next, in the hushed way of information that carries both relief and discomfort at once. Someone had seen her wagon loaded. Someone else had noticed the lamp in her coupe burning at an unusual hour. A third person had simply done the arithmetic. Her hens had not stopped. Every other farm in the township had gone quiet. Hers had not. By the time the first man appeared at her gate, she was inside sorting the morning's yield onto a wide cloth she used for counting. 22 eggs. She had not yet written it in the ledger. She heard the gate before she heard the knock. It had a particular sound when it was opened slowly, the latch catching and then being lifted with care, the way someone moves who is uncertain of their welcome. She recognized that kind of careful movement. She had made it herself, at other people's doors, in other seasons, when she had needed something and was not sure she had the right to ask. She opened the door before he knocked. He was one of the men from the fence line at the auction. She knew him by his coat, a dark wool one with a mended collar, and by the way he stood, which was the way a man stands when he has said something he cannot unsay and knows it. He did not meet her eyes directly. He looked at the ground near her feet, then at the side of the door frame, then briefly at her face, and then away again. He asked whether she had any eggs to spare. She said yes. She said the price. It was the same price she had settled on in her own mind several weeks before. Not low, not punishing, but fair. The kind of price that reflected the work of feeding and tending through cold weather, and nothing more than that. She had not arrived at it in any moment of feeling. She had figured it simply, the same way she figured the cost of grain against the expected yield of a laying hen in winter. He nodded when she said it, just once and without comment. She went inside and retrieved a smaller basket, the one she used for single household orders, and came back to the step. He stood in the yard while she counted eggs into the cloth lining. She did not hurry. She held each egg briefly before placing it, the way her hands had learned to do, checking without thinking a small rotation, the surface against her palm. Smooth and whole and cold from the shelf. She placed 12 in the basket and covered them with the cloth. He reached into his coat for the coins. His hand was stiff from the cold. She waited without comment while he counted them out, and then she accepted them and set the basket down where he could take it. He walked back down the lane the same way he had come. She watched him go, not from any feeling about his leaving, but because the lane ran past the chicken yard, and she wanted to see if the sound of him bothered the hens. It did not. They moved along the fence line without hurrying, heads tipped toward the cold ground. She went back inside and entered the coins in her ledger. Then she set water on the stove for the evening mash. That had been this morning. The afternoon was quieter. Now she was thinking about a different morning. Earlier in the season, before the deep cold had settled, when the frost still lifted by midday and the fields were hard but not yet locked. She had heard it from two directions before she saw it herself. First from the woman at the feed store, who mentioned it without particular feeling while counting out grain. Then from a man who stopped at her gate to say his neighbor's last birds had gone off lay and weren't likely to come back before spring. She had nodded at both of them and said little. When she passed the neighboring farm later that week, she could see the coupe from the road. The door was propped open. No movement inside, no sound from the yard. The cold had done what cold does to birds not built for it. Not killed them outright, but shut them down. Stopped the laying as completely as if a lamp had been blown out. The flock was still alive, probably, but it was as good as gone for the season. She had kept walking. At home, she noted the overnight temperature in the small record she kept. a folded piece of paper she tucked inside the feed barrel, where it stayed dry. She had been watching for any sign of stress in her own birds. She checked their combs in the morning, the color and weight of the eggs, the amount of feed they consumed. She had adjusted the mash 2 weeks earlier, adding a little more grain to the mix, a thicker consistency than she used in fall. Not a large change. Enough. The coop held its warmth well. She had packed the last gaps in late October, before the first hard freeze, and the straw on the floor was deep and dry. The birds roosted close together at night, which they would have done without her help. That was the nature of the breed. They knew how to manage cold in a way that newer birds had been bred away from. She did not say any of this to anyone. There was no occasion to say it. The neighbors had not asked her about the breed or her methods. They had simply reported what had happened to their birds, and she had listened, and the conversation had moved on. She kept the water unfrozen. She kept the mash warm. The orders had begun quietly, the way most things did in that part of the country. A woman from the far end of the main road had knocked at the gate one morning, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and asked without much preamble whether there were eggs to spare. There were. The following day, 2 more households sent word. By the end of that week, she had written down 5 names on a scrap of paper, which she folded and tucked beneath the small wooden shelf she had nailed to the inside wall of the coop, just beside the door where the light was better in the mornings. The shelf held a tin cup for the feed scoop, a short stub of pencil, and the paper. That was all it needed to hold. She updated the tally each morning after the collection was done, when the baskets were still warm in her hands from the hens' overnight work. The numbers were not large. They did not need to be large. What they needed to be was steady, and they were. 20 to 24 eggs most mornings. Occasionally a few more. Occasionally 1 or 2 fewer, depending on the previous night's cold. She had learned to read the variation and accept it. The hens were not machines. They were old breed birds doing what old breed birds had always done through frost and short days, which was to keep on laying at a pace that newer flocks could not match, and that most farmers in the township had stopped believing was possible. The feed store had sent its own inquiry through an intermediary, a man who handled small accounts for the owner. She had agreed to a standing weekly order. A woman who ran a kitchen in town, serving simple meals at midday, had asked for 2 dozen every 3 days. She agreed to that as well. She wrote each arrangement down in the same careful hand, added it to the column on the paper, and nailed the paper back to the wall. The debt on the land had a fixed number. She had known that number for so long it had taken on the quality of a stone she carried in her coat pocket, always present, always the same weight. In the past weeks, she had begun to feel it lighten. Not gone, not yet near gone, but the payments she was making against it were real and they were regular, and the difference between a debt that is growing and a debt that is shrinking is not always visible to anyone watching from outside. She felt it. Each morning, the baskets went out full. Each evening, she filled the feeders, checked the water, noted the condition of the straw, and went back to the house. The work had a rhythm to it now that felt less like survival and more like something she was building, slowly and without ceremony, in the ordinary cold. There was a moment at the auction she had returned to many times since, not in the way a person returns to a regret, but in the way a person returns to a place where something true happened. She had been standing near the back of the pen, the cold coming in sideways, under the gate, and she had looked at those 29 birds and understood something that could not have been put into clean language at the time. It was not a thought exactly, It was closer to recognition. The kind that happens in the body before it reaches the mind. They were ragged, yes. Half their feathers gone or coming in patchy and dull. Two of them had the bare-necked look that made other buyers step back and shake their heads. But she had watched them for several minutes before she raised her hand, and what she had watched was not what the other farmers were watching. They were watching the feathers, or the absence of them. She was watching how the birds moved, the deliberate, unhurried quality of it, the way they held their weight low and close, conserving, the way they ate from the trough without rushing. Her elder had told her once that a hen who eats slowly in the cold is a hen who has learned how to live in the cold, and that was worth more than any amount of glossy plumage. Her elder had known the old breeds by their behavior as much as their appearance. She had said that the breeds people had mostly forgotten were forgotten for the wrong reasons, not because they were weak, but because they were slow to impress. They did not perform well at a glance. You had to watch them a while. Now she stood at the latch of the coupe in the early morning, the frost thick on the wood, and she rested her hand there the same way she might rest it on something settled and known. The gate was hers. The land under it was hers, or near enough now that the difference felt like the last page of something rather than the beginning of a question. 29 birds. She had counted them through the pen slats twice before bidding, out of habit, not doubt. 29. The same number she lifted her hand for, the same number she had carried home in the wagon bed wrapped in old feed sacks against the wind, the same number she had set down in the straw of the repaired coupe and watched spread out slowly, quietly, without alarm, as though they recognized the place as adequate. She had felt, that evening, the particular satisfaction of a choice made correctly in circumstances that did not allow for more than one chance to be correct. The morning was still, inside the coupe, soft sounds, small movements, the ordinary beginning of another full day. She opened the coupe door and stood back while the hens settled into their morning rhythm. Light came in low and gray, the way it did in late winter when the sun had not yet decided how much warmth it intended to give. She did not rush them. She filled the feeders, poured the warm mash, watched the steam rise off it, and disappear. The 29 birds moved around her feet with the unhurried confidence of animals that had been consistently fed and consistently warm, and had no particular reason to expect otherwise. She gathered the last baskets by count, stacked them carefully in the wagon bed, each one padded with straw so nothing shifted on the frozen road. It was the largest single delivery she had made, and it would settle the last of what she owed on the land. She had not planned for that exactly. She had planned to survive the winter. Everything after that had followed from the chickens, doing what she had believed they would do, which was the same thing her grandmother's birds had done in the cold years she remembered as a girl. Lay steadily, complain quietly, ask only for a dry floor and a warm mash, and someone patient enough to give it. The wagon was ready before the sun had cleared the tree line. She checked the harness, checked the baskets once more, then went back to the coupe and latched the door properly against the wind. Inside, the hens murmured in the straw. That sound had become ordinary to her over the course of the winter, the small, continuous proof of a decision made correctly. She climbed onto the wagon seat and let the horse find its pace down the lane toward the county road. The fields on either side were still frozen hard, the soil locked under a thin crust of snow that the sun had not yet touched. She passed the fence lines of neighboring farms without looking. Not from pride, not from any wish to avoid the sight, simply because there was nothing there that required her attention. The empty coupes were their own story, and it was not hers to tell. The road into town was quiet at that hour. Her breath showed in the cold. The baskets sat solid and full behind her. Ahead, the feed store would be waiting, and the orders she had promised, and the quiet transaction of handing over what she had grown through the long cold months in exchange for what she needed to carry forward. She did not think about the auction, or the laughter over the fence, or the long first nights in the repaired coupe, listening for sounds that did not come. Those things had already done their work. They had shaped the winter into what it had been, and the winter had shaped the land into what it was now. Hers, fully, without remainder. She drove toward town,